Дыни, арбузы, пшеничные булки, щедрый зажиточный край. И на престоле сидит в Петербурге.
By the so-called Normandy format, that's Germany, France, Ukraine, and Russia as an observer. The idea of the Minsk Accords was that Ukraine would undertake certain legal changes that preserved the cultural, ethnic, and linguistic rights of the Russian population of the Donbass, which there was a struggle on since 2014. Yeah. In return, Donbass would remain part of Ukraine because the Donbass had tried to declare independence prior to this. And so this was negotiated, but then we ran into the spectacle from 2015 until literally 2022. Ukraine never acted on this. And the Ukrainians always said, well, it's very difficult for us politically. I mean, and we know that. We know Poroshenko was told that if he signed Minsk, he was going to die. Zelensky was told the same thing. If you sign Minsk, you die. This was by the Nazis, the ones that don't exist. They're the ones, the non-existent Nazis are threatening to kill the presidents of an ostensibly sovereign democratic nation if they enter into an agreement that had been negotiated with other powers. And this was the narrative that was playing along.
Yeah.
But Poroshenko stripped that away. He said, we never intended to implement Minsk. Minsk was only a vehicle to buy time so that we could militarize, that is, build up a military capable of being a military trained by NATO, equipped by NATO, capable of taking the Donbass back and maybe Crimea. Mm-hmm. Now, the interesting thing about that is that it appears that Poroshenko's narrative is the narrative that Germany and France were operating on also, and the United States, meaning NATO. NATO was operating under this. NATO was using the Minsk Accords as a vehicle to buy time while NATO trained the Ukrainian army so that the Ukrainian army, acting as a proxy of NATO, could launch an offensive operation against the Donbass, occupy it, and then push Russia out of Crimea. This was the NATO plan all along. To use the Ukrainian military as a proxy army to attack Russia. So that Ukraine could be seized away from the Russian orbit once and for all. This is why, when this war, the special military operation started, and Vladimir Putin and his generals were saying, we have no choice but to attack now because the Ukrainians have amassed this massive force that are going to attack in the next couple of days or weeks, the Donbass. So we have to preempt their attack. That's why they cited Article 51, peremptory collective self-defense. Authorized, under the United Nations Charter. Everybody went, you're just making that up. That's just the Russians playing a legal game. No, it's real. It's real. Yeah. Ukraine had massed around 100,000 troops, trained by NATO, equipped by NATO, led by officers operating under instructions from NATO who were ready to attack the Donbass sometime in early March. So that's the reality of the situation. So NATO was always going to go to war against Russia, but not as NATO, using the Ukrainian army.
Yeah.
Now, the way they were going to pressure the Russians not to interfere with this was through economic means. I mean, we know this because Joe Biden met with Vladimir Putin in June of 2021 in Geneva, Switzerland, where he supposedly sat down and stared Putin in the eyes, his steely-eyed Joe Biden stare. And he said, if you attack Ukraine, we will hit you with most stringent economic sanctions ever. Your country will collapse. Your economy will fail. It'll be awful for you. You can't even think about this. And Putin went, spasiba. And he went back and he told his guys, they're going to hit us with everything they got economically. What are we going to do? And they spent the next couple months preparing a plan so that when, and the thing about NATO and Europe, they bought into the American plan. They bought into the premise that even if Russia does attack Ukraine, it can't sustain this attack because we're going to hit Russia with everything we got economically, and their economy is going to collapse. You remember, I'm going to make rubble out of the ruble.
Yes.
So Biden's fantastic.
Catchy. Very catchy phrase. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's wonderful. And everybody chuckles, he's going to make rubble out of the ruble. Yeah. And then, on and on and on. The idea was the economy would collapse. The Russian people would rise up, switch out, and victory to the Ukraine, Slava Ukraina. There's a problem, though, and it's called Russia. The Russians are smarter and better at doing this kind of stuff than we are. They're more focused. They're serious actors. And when they were ready for the sanctions, and I don't need to get long story short, all we have to do is say the sanctions boomerang. It's not the Russian economy that's collapsing right now. No. It's the European economy.
Correct.
It's the American economy.
Yeah.
The ruble isn't rubble. The ruble's stronger than it has been in some time now, and it's going to get stronger. Russia's relations with the world are stronger than before. Not with the West. They've never been strong with the West. Not with the United States. Russia doesn't care. They divorced from us. They're now focused eastwards towards China. An alliance that's better than any alliance in the world, we're told, and apparently it is. Yeah. They have strong relationships with India, with the rest of the world. They're selling their oil. For an economy that's supposed to be collapsing, they had a $100 billion surplus last quarter. They're going to have a $150 billion surplus. I think Joe Biden would die for a surplus. Like he'd die for a surplus of $1. Going to die. But Russia will not lose this fight. Russia cannot lose this fight unless there's an absolute loss of political will. And while I don't know Vladimir Putin personally, from what I've read about him, I don't think he's the kind of guy that wakes up in the morning and says, I made a mistake in Ukraine. I'm going to surrender today. I think he's committed to victory. I think the Russian people are committed to victory. The Russian military is committed to victory, and there will be a victory. It will take time. We have a hint on how much time. Denis Pushilin, the president of the Donetsk People's Republic, spoke at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum last week on Russian soil at a forum hosted by the Russian president. So one would assume that his words have been carefully considered. And he said that the special military operation will probably end sometime by the end of the year. So we have months of fighting ahead, but it's months of fighting where the Russians are in 100% control of what's going on the battlefield. And what's going on the battlefield is that the Ukrainians are dying at a prodigious rate. We're talking hundreds, in some cases thousands of dead per day. You're right. I guess we need to understand two things, or at least I need to explain two things in order for my answer to make sense. And that okay to understand. I'm not here to dictate to anybody. I'll give you my perception. Right. My perception is that NATO is an institution that takes on because it's existed for so long, it's assumed an independent character, a personality that might be different from the personalities of its constituent nations. Mm-hmm. So to give you an example, when a ambassador from Bulgaria goes into NATO headquarters, he now is in lockstep with NATO think, how NATO works. And NATO's become a self-licking ice cream cone, which means it exists only for itself. It doesn't exist to do anything else. It has no mission. It has no purpose. It has no viability. It exists to exist. Here we are, coming into, the summer months, and we tend to forget what was going on just a year ago today. Afghanistan was collapsing. Yeah. And by August, it had collapsed. NATO and the United States had suffered one of the greatest political and military defeats in modern history. Yes. A 20-year debacle, which was punctuated by this desperate airlift out of Kabul, which just embarrassed and humiliated the West. And NATO had been humiliated by the United States. abandoned by the United States, told you're on your own, get out on your own. We have our own plan, and NATO fled, and many NATO members were saying, well, who are we? What are we? What do we do?
Yeah.
And then, of course, Joe Biden said, trust me, I will reinvigorate us with a new enemy, because an organization like NATO has to have a focus. So the new focus became Russia, which was the old focus, but now was refocused. Mm-hmm. It is refocused through the lens of not just Ukraine, but Ukraine is interpreted by Poland, by the Czech Republic, by the Baltic states, by these 5 nations that were virulently anti-Russian to begin with.
Yeah.
And so they served to magnify the issue of Ukraine so that it became an existential crisis for NATO. It didn't need to be. NATO, but except that NATO needed a reason to exist now. And so now Russia became the reason, and Ukraine became an existential matter, not just for Russia, because everybody knew that if you carved Ukraine out of the Russian sphere, that this would strategically weaken Russia, but also for NATO having committed to this objective. So NATO has this strategic objective of survival. Remember, this is an institution that needs to survive.
Yeah.
France doesn't need NATO to survive. England doesn't need NATO to survive. No nation needs NATO to survive. NATO needs NATO to survive. That's it. That's all there is. This is an organization that long ago lost a viable reason to exist. It only exists to please itself. It is literally the self-licking ice cream cone that now decided that we're going to make an issue of Ukraine. But there are 30 members of NATO, and NATO is a consensus-driven organization, and you need all 30 members to agree. And here's the weakness of NATO, that while Joe Biden can come into NATO leadership and paint this picture of how NATO needs to confront Russia, be focused on Russia, Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, can get up and give speech after speech after speech. At the end of the day, it comes down to what the constituent states want. And because it's a consensus organization, most states say, well, we will follow the lead, so to speak. But then this conflict took on, first of all, this was never supposed to be an armed conflict. I mean, not the way it is.
Right.
I think we learned something, though. We learned something very interesting from the words of Poroshenko, Peter Poroshenko, the former president of Ukraine. Poroshenko came out last week and said the Minsk II Accords, 2015, a framework for peace, an agreement that had
Да дурака валяли. Разговаривать. Он так говорит. Почему же тогда в утилитарном государстве, Украина утилитарное государство, правильно? Великобритания утилитарное государство, Германия утилитарное государство. У них есть один
Соединенных Штатах федерализации? В Соединенных Штатах федерация? Я слышал. Да? Да? А как называется? Соединенные Штаты Америки. Это федерация? Вот смысл федерации. Ну, Королев всегда сразу и снится нам неровно рассмотрёва, Венера ледяная синева. А снится нам трава узёва, зелёная трава.
Как он дошел с тобой сегодня? Ты принял, что ли? А я вообще не принял. Не слушай. И их, в общем-то, всех и назвали русские, потому что это глагол. Русские это какой, чей отвечает.
Тебя связали кумачом и опустили на колени. Сверкнул топор над палачом, а приговор тебя прочел кровавый царь великий. Гений!